Can you all hear me okay? Good. And can you hear me okay? Awesome. I am really grateful that you're here today. I realize this is California, and you have lots to do, and you have lots of sunshine. When I flew here 2 days ago from Wisconsin, it was 17 degrees. It was so hard to come. You can see I did not dress for the weather, though. But it is great to be here, especially on a Friday night. I appreciate that. And I'm going to give you a very solid informational talk. What I want to say at the beginning is, as a university professor, I just can't say things. I have to document them. Every piece of information you're going to see here tonight is documented. I tell you exactly where I got it from, and I will give it, the whole presentation I'll give to you free. When I'm done, I'm going to put a website up there. You can go to that website and ask for the slides. I will email them to you. Everything you're going to see tonight you can have, because I want you to take it. And you don't know me, so I do not ask you to trust me. In fact, I hope you don't trust me. I hope you will take the time to get the free slides, and you will verify I'm telling you the truth. I've given 350 talks on Common Core in 40 different states in the last 2 years. No one has ever gotten back to me to say, hey, that wasn't true. But please, I ask only that you listen, not that you trust me. Take my information for free, verify I'm telling you the truth, and if I am telling you the truth, then I have just one request of you. Hold the people who tell you Common Core is good to the same standard. One of the great problems we have is I have to document what I say, but the people telling you that Common Core is state-led, it's not. The people telling you that Common Core is rigorous, it's not. The people telling you that Common Core is all sorts of things, it's not. Ask them to prove it. I'm going to prove to you how I know what I know. Keep your schools and your politicians honest. That's the only way we're going to get anywhere with this. And the other thing I like to say at the beginning of the talk is that this is an apolitical problem. This is not a Democrat problem or a Republican problem. This is not political that way. There are many Republicans who support Common Core. There are many Democrats who don't. There are Democrats who love Common Core and Republicans who hate it. This is not a right versus left issue. This is a political class versus the rest of us issue. The people behind Common Core, and there are many Republicans and Democrats in these camps, the people behind Common Core are people who believe that the federal government and the federal government alone should determine what goes on with your kids. That the Beltway in Washington, the people who think that more power taken from you and given to the feds is a good thing. That's who we're dealing with. So over the course of this talk, you will hear me call out politicians on the left and the right. I hope you'll recognize by the time we're done that there are many, many people on both sides of the issue. I also want to say that this is I believe, and you'll see in about half an hour why I believe this. I think the only way you can support teachers is to be opposed to Common Core. The only way you can support teachers is to oppose it. I will make that case moving forward, and I'll document why I say that. So we have tremendous respect for teachers. I'm a 22-year teacher. I've taught at the college, the high school level, the Christian high school level. I've taught in all those different venues. I know how hard it is to be a teacher. You'll see what I mean when I tell you the best thing you can do to help teachers is to get them out of this. We'll talk about that moving forward. And then the last little bit of business is I ask you please to hold all questions to the end. I'll stick around and answer any questions you have as long as I have to do it. But if you can't talk about Common Core in 30 minutes, you just can't do it an overview. You need a little time. So I want to be respectful of your time. Let me finish the talk, and then people who want to leave after the talk can go, and then I'll stick around and answer questions for all of you. And the last thing I like to do is ask you a question. I want you to do me a favor. As you sit here today, Common Core has been with us for 6 years. Its inception, its origins, its evolution, 6 years ago. It's been in the schools in a noticeable way going on 3 years now. Can I just ask you by a simple show of hands, how many of you here today still really don't know what it is or are confused about who did it and why? Would you raise your hands if that's true? And would you look around? Easily 50+% of you. This has been with us. This is the first strike against Common Core. 6 years in the making, 3 years in your school so as to notice it, and half of our audience here today doesn't really understand what it is. This is a big deal. Whether you love Common Core or hate it, it's a big deal. This represents a complete transformation of education. It rivals what happened with the healthcare law. And say what you will about the Obamacare Act, love it or hate it, the fact is that that national healthcare law had a hearing before the Senate and the Congress and the Supreme Court. This never did. None of that was done with this. Moms and dads were never consulted about any of this. Your state took it. It was in your schools before any of you ever heard of it. That wasn't done here. No state legislatures ever voted to take it. They weren't given the option. This has never been debated. The Department of teachers' unions weren't consulted on this. The state governors did not willingly accept this. This was not a creation of the states or the governors. This whole thing was done off the grid. It is as transformational as the healthcare law, more so because it's dealing with your kids. What Abraham Lincoln said is exactly right. The philosophy of the classroom in one generation is the philosophy of government in the next. If we can take an entire generation of kids and completely transform the way they learn, what they learn, and how they learn it, then those kids are going to be very different kids. And the government will be a very different kind of government in a very short order. I'm going to document all these claims. I'm going to show you what I mean. But the stakes couldn't be higher. And given that we've got so many of you who are really kind of in the dark, I'm going to start very broad. What is Common Core? Common Core is an abbreviated term used to refer to the Common Core State Standards Initiative, a set of national standards for English and math with science guidelines, everything else forthcoming. Now, this is pretty shocking. You, California, had to agree to take English and math. Those were the first two sets of standards that were rolled out. You did. A very small number of individuals in your state opted to do that without consulting anybody. You never agreed to the other standards, but they're putting them in anyway. They're no longer consulting you. You took English and math, now you're going to get the rest of them, whether you want them or not. And science is the next one to be fed into your schools. As we sit here today, the science standards are now being put in your schools without having been consulted. And Common Core is branding so badly. The term is branding so badly. 2 years ago, 89% of Americans didn't know what Common Core was. As of a recent Gallup survey poll about 90 days ago, 74% of American moms and dads want it gone. Overwhelming. What's happened in 2 years? They've begun to see it work in the schools. All right? Teachers unions are running away from Common Core in record numbers. I'll show you the evidence on that too, because they're starting to see what it is. Common Core's reaction to that is not to change or to stop. They're simply renaming all the subsequent standards. The Common Core science standards have been renamed the Next Generation Science Standards because they're pretty confident that when you don't hear the word Common Core, you'll assume it's not there anymore. You're going to see right from the outset that I believe transparency is important. It's why I'm going to give you all my information free. It's why I document it. The people who did this to you didn't do any of this. They're not telling you the truth. They're being dishonest. And one of the ways they're being dishonest is by renaming the subsequent standards. It is the plan of Common Core to line up every single aspect of your kid's curriculum with Common Core. That includes art, music, gym, all aligned with big, broad national standards, all requiring one-size-fits-all mega tests that your kids will be taking for weeks and weeks and weeks in their schools. This is the wave of the future. So their English and math is what you have. Science is being fed in. So who wrote them? You hear from your schools, you hear from your educators and your politicians that Common Core is state-led. I mean, that's why they call it the Common Core State Standards, right? But to be state-led, there has to be some evidence. Common Core was conceived, paid for, written, drafted, revalidated, and put in 46 states in the Union before anybody in those states had a chance to look at it. That's what happened. And after you took it, California, some administrators and teachers in your state got to see the standards after you took them, but they couldn't change them. They couldn't reject them. They couldn't amend them. It was a fait accompli. States had nothing to do with this. I'm going to prove that point to you. Who wrote Common Core? Let me prove it. Let me start by proving it. This right here is the actual copyright for Common Core. And notice what it says. These two groups, these two Washington lobbyist groups, the NGA and the CCSSO. The NGA and the CCSSO shall be acknowledged as the sole owners and developers of the Common Core state standards, and no claims to the contrary shall be made. That's Common Core's copyright. Do you see the hypocrisy here? We, two Washington lobbyist groups, wrote and developed the standards. You're not even allowed to say otherwise. It's kind of like pulling a tag off a mattress, right? Mm-hmm. Technically, I could get in trouble for even daring to suggest somebody else wrote the standards than the states. And yet, these two groups claim them. How can it be state-led when the two groups that did this copyrighted them. They didn't. They couldn't have. Let's talk briefly about who these two groups are, because the NGA stands for the National Governors Association. And that's why your state will tell you this was state-led, because, well, surely 50 state governors got together, locked themselves in a room, and banged out education standards. That did not happen. I wish it would have. I wish Common Core was written. I wish every state governor in the country got together and wrote these standards. Not because they'd be any good, because, let's be honest, what qualifies your governor? You got the most liberal governor in the country. What qualifies him to write education standards? Nothing. In Wisconsin, I have the most conservative governor in the country, Scott Walker. What qualifies him to write education standards? Not a thing. But if the governors had done this, you at least could unelect a governor. You have some representation. The two Washington lobbyist groups that did this, if you decide, California, you don't like the standards, how do you get at these people? They're not government officials. Public education is public, which means it belongs to you. You weren't consulted on this. And if you decide you don't like the standards, like states all across the country are doing, how do you get at these people? There's no representation here. They've never been elected to anything. They have no authority. What allowed them to do it in the first place? And let me make my point about the national governors. Does anybody know who the sitting governor chair of the NGA was for a good deal of time Common Core was being put in your schools? That would be Governor Mary Fallin of Oklahoma. And about a year ago, Mary Fallin pulled Oklahoma completely out of Common Core. And do you know why she did it? Because the states weren't consulted. That's the chair of the NGA. In fact, if you go to the National Governors Association website, they'll tell you what they are. They are a lobbying group, a trade organization, whose sole purpose is to bring activists and lobbyists, people with money, into the presence of governors and their aides. That's all it is. So go back to this copyright for a moment. This really should, even if you think you like Common Core, even if you think it's a great idea, this should really make you mad. Because I call this banana republic stuff. This is not what goes on in a constitutional republic. You have no idea who these people are. They have no real educational background. What qualifies them to do this? Who allowed them to do this? So you've got two unelected, unaccountable to you and me lobbyist groups who wrote the standards. As a matter of fact, and I know some of you are taking notes, write this name down for me. Joy Pullman, P-U-L-L-M-A-N. Joy, who works at the Heartland Institute in Chicago, she has written the definitive article on the 5 people who wrote Common Core. 5. They had some help at the lower levels, but there are 5 people responsible for the standards, but all 5 working in those 2 lobbyist groups. Do you know that the 5 people who wrote Common Core have very little experience with education and no experience with national standards at all? The man chiefly responsible for the standards is a man by the name of David Coleman, C-O-L-E-M-A-N. The liberal Huffington Post website calls David Coleman the most powerful education administrator that nobody's ever heard of. David Coleman is the architect of Common Core. It says so on his own Wikipedia page. And yet, David Coleman has never taught a classroom. He's never taught in his life. He has no formal training in education at all. Not a degree. Not a course. The man most responsible for the standards has never been an educator. He's the guy responsible. And you're going to love this. No sooner did David Coleman oversee the writing of the Common Core standards than he immediately left Common Core and miraculously became the president of the college boards, where the same man who wrote Common Core is now rewriting your kids' entrance exams to college, the ACTs and the SATs in particular. The same man who wrote Common Core, who you never heard of, who's never been elected to anything, who's never been a teacher or an educator, is now in control of the SATs, the exams your kids are going to have to take to get into college, and he's rewritten them to conform to Common Core. You see what I mean by banana republic? Nobody knows who this guy is. He has no education credentials. Not only has he transformed your kids' schools, but now he's going to force your kids to study Common Core under the threat that they won't get into college if they don't. That's pretty shocking. That's who David Coleman is. So 5 individuals and 2 lobbyist groups. Who paid for all of this? Well, go back to 2007, 8, and 9. Bill Gates, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. As you sit here today, Bill Gates has spent over $6 billion on Common Core, advertising it, propagandizing it, giving big monetary grants to groups who support it. As a matter of fact, there's not a major educational organization in this country that supports Common Core that was not paid by Bill Gates to do so. The National PTA, right? We think of the Parent Teachers Association, we think of somebody looking out for our kids. Yet the National PTA received multiple million-dollar checks from Bill Gates back in 2009. And the National PTA was advertising and promoting Common Core in the States before the standards were even written. Before anybody at the PTA even knew what they were going to be, they were bought by Gates to push this to your kids. Why did 170 Roman Catholic diocese schools take Common Core the very first year they could without being even asked to by the feds? Well, could it be that the NCEA, the chief watchdog of our Catholic schools, the National Catholic Education Association, they took hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in money from Bill Gates to push this in the Catholic schools? Think about that for a second. The only thing Bill Gates has donated more of his money to than Common Core is abortion, eugenics, and population control in Africa. How does that partner up with the Catholic Church? But that's why your Catholic schools took this, because they were paid to do so. Look at the major educational organizations that all support Common Core, all of them. Because Bill Gates' charitable foundation, the Gates Foundation, it's a public trust. You can see online where they spent their money. And they spent their money buying support for this. There's no other way to look at it. Can I ask you, what qualifies Bill Gates? What are his education credentials? Isn't he the guy that dropped out of college because it was absolutely worthless and opened a company in a garage and made $1 billion? What are his credentials for this? 5 individuals, 2 Washington lobbyists, paid for by Bill and Melinda Gates. So that's how it happened. And you know the irony? The people who defend Common Core don't even dispute this anymore. The evidence is too obvious. It's all out there. That's how do you call this state-led? What I'm going to do as I go through this talk today is I'm going to set up the 5 biggest lies of Common Core. That's number 1, that this is state-led. Their own copyright belies them. This is how it was done. So, all right, so you've proved, more or less, because you're going to verify it, you've proved that Common Core isn't state-led. But that doesn't mean it's federal. How do you know it's federal? Well, who controls public education in this country? The Department of Education, the Federal Department of Education. Do you honestly think the federal government would allow somebody to do this if they didn't want it done? You've been watching government, the American government, for the last 30, 40 years. This is a government that spends all of its time letting you do less so it can do more. Do you think the Department of Education would have allowed 5 individuals and 2 lobbyist groups and 1 billionaire to completely transform the public schools if they didn't want it done? And I don't care how much money Bill Gates has. He has no ability whatsoever to buy this into the schools. He bought the support of the Parent Teachers Association, but they can't put it in your schools. He bought the support of the NCEA, but he can't force that into the Catholic schools. There's only one entity in this country that could have done it. That's your federal government. How many of you have heard of the Federal Race to the Top program? Anybody? All right, quite a bit of you. You may recall back in 2008 and 2009 when the outgoing Republican President Bush and the incoming Democrat President Obama said we need billions and billions and billions of taxpayer money to stimulate a dying economy. If we didn't get those billions right away to bail out banks and car companies, the whole system would collapse, said the Republican and the Democrat. But what you don't know is that the President of the United States, President Obama, siphoned off billions of dollars from the stimulus and gave it to the Department of Education to begin to create stuff like this. I'll prove that to you in a moment. So what did they do? In 2009, the federal government created the Federal Race to the Top program. It was basically touted as a stimulus for education. The president and Arne Duncan, your Secretary of Education, they encouraged all 50 states in the union to apply for Race to the Top grant money. And 46 received it. 46 states got some. The big deal about the Race to the Top program was it was a federal giveaway. So I'll give you an example. In 2009, New York became the very first state in the union to win a Race to the Top grant. New York received $700 million of taxpayer funds in 2009. That money went directly to the New York State Board of Education. They could spend it on anything they wanted to. computers, tetherballs, substitute teachers. Do you know what the only meaningful provision for any state that took race to the top money was? Any state that took race to the top money had to accept the Common Core state standards when they were finally written. That's how 46 states got it without ever seeing them. Simply because in 2009 and 10, states were desperate for education dollars. The federal government gave away multiple billions of dollars across the states. And the only provision for any state that took the money was you had to take the standards when we finally get around to writing them. Your states were bribed into taking Common Core. That's pretty shocking. It was the Race to the Top program. The only thing that put it in your schools was a federal program. That's why it's a federal curriculum, federal standards. As a matter of fact, I don't know why it took this long, but we now have our first state governor who is suing the federal government for the illegality of this. Because you know, right, that the federal government of the United States is by law prohibited from creating national standards or a national curriculum. 3 different federal statutes from 1965 prohibit the federal government from creating national standards and national curriculum. In fact, go before that, the 10th Amendment to the US Constitution prohibits the federal government from meddling in state educational decisions. So what then is this copyright? It is merely a cheap attempt by the feds to indemnify themselves from the legality of this. They wanted to take over education the same way they successfully took over healthcare, but they couldn't do it legally. There was nothing blocking them necessarily from taking over healthcare. At least that's what one Supreme Court justice decided. But when it comes to your kids' education, they were legally prohibited. So they allowed these 2 Washington lobbyist groups, these 5 people, to write the standards, copyright them, but it was the feds who put them in your schools. We've now reached the point where we have the first state governor who's suing the federal government for the illegality of this. That's Bobby Jindal, the governor of Louisiana. And about 16 different state governors are contemplating, including some organizations in California, are considering jumping on the bandwagon to sue the feds. This is illegal. That's how you got it. So when they say it's state-led, what's your evidence for that? You saw the copyright, then mention the states. In fact, the copyright says if you blame it on the states, you're in violation of the copyright. And yet your principals, your superintendents, your politicians tell you every day this is state-led. 2 lobbyist groups, 5 individuals, Bill Gates' money, and 1 big federal program. Now let me ask you this question by way of an analogy. Do you think the schools, do you think the politicians, do you think your superintendents and principals would still like Common Core if it was exactly the same set of standards? If instead of Bill Gates, it was the evil Koch brothers who put up $6 billion? Do you think they'd be okay with that? And if instead of the Gates, it was the Kochs, and instead of 2 left-leaning lobbyist groups, you had 2 right-leaning lobbyist groups who basically bribed 46 states to take a set of curriculum standards nobody had seen. Instead of a very liberal president, you had a very conservative one who had done this with taxpayer money. Do you think your newspapers would stay silent about it? Because I got to tell you, if that had happened, I would oppose it every bit as vehemently as I oppose this. But you know what I'm saying. If it had been the Kochs instead of the Gates, if it had been a right-wing Republican president instead of a left-wing Democrat one, if it had been 2 right-wing lobbyist groups, we wouldn't be putting up with it. If it had been the Koch brothers instead of the Gates, Harry Reid's head would explode all over the Senate floor. Your newspapers every single day would have splattered on them, rogue billionaire buys public education. What qualifies these people to have done this? They weren't elected to anything. They have no real educational backgrounds. Who allowed this? My point to you is, even if you think you like the standards, if we allow this, you're no longer a constitutional republic. This is no longer a free state, a free nation. These people did an end run around the Constitution, an end run around the law, to put these in to get at your kids. Before we even talk about the standards, that's critical. That's how we got it. There's your copyright. Now, interestingly, the objections to Common Core started right away. And in these 350 talks, 40 states, you know the only really meaningful argument I ever get? It's one made in your papers every day. If you oppose Common Core, it's because you're a right-wing, tinfoil hat-wearing teabagger. That's it. That's not an argument. That's an insult, right? But that's it. That's the whole strategy of the pro-Common Core side. The only people who oppose Common Core are right-wing lunatics. Okay, fine. Don't mind the slur. But so I decided to do something kind of interesting, I think. I'm going to show you in about an hour why Common Core isn't going to work, and why it's illegal. I'm going to show you exclusively from left-wing sources. Everything you're about to see, all of this information, is from left-wing progressive Democrats. All of it. If you want to give me a week, I'll show you all the right-wing opposition to Common Core. You want to give me 2 weeks to talk to you? I'll show you all the Christian, religious objections to Common Core. But we don't need to do that. Everything I'm going to show you for the next hour comes directly from progressive liberals. And it started in 2009 with the 2 top lawyers at the Department of Education. The 2 lawyers whose job it was to make sure the Department of Education was obeying the Constitution. The lawyers said they're not. With respect to the race to the top Common Core scheme, Robert S. Eitel and Kent D. Talbert, former Deputy General Counsel and General Counsel, respectively, of the U.S. Department of Education, concluded that, quote, these standards and tests will ultimately direct the course of elementary and secondary study in most states across the Union, running the risk that states become little more than administrative agents for a national K-12 program and raising a fundamental question about whether the Department of Education has overstepped its statutory boundaries. These 2 gentlemen, now that they're not with the Department of Ed, they've written a 40-page paper available for free at the Pioneer Institute site, in which they cite all the legal reasons this is illegal. The 2 lawyers hired by the Department of Ed said this is not right. Okay? And I'm an English professor, right? So words are my business, but I need your help with a little word puzzle. Are you game? I'm going to give you 5 words. And I want you to tell me if there's any way you can rearrange these 5 words to make it come out right-wing. You ready? New York State Teachers Union. It's a tough one, isn't it? I want you to notice the date on this. January of last year, about a year ago. The Board of New York's Teachers Union, on Saturday, unanimously voted to withdraw support for the Common Core state standards as they are being implemented, and they declared no confidence in the state's education commissioner. Who brought Common Core to New York? It wasn't the governors, wasn't the people, wasn't the state. The superintendent of public schools in New York simply took $700 million, and the whole state was legally obligated to take Common Core. And the New York State Teachers Union, hardly a right-wing entity, wants him fired and the standards removed immediately. The New York State United Teachers, a union that represents more than 600,000 educational professionals in the state of New York, is also asking the Board of Regents to remove State Education Commissioner John King from office. And although the union previously supported the Common Core standards, the union says it will not support the standards either as they are implemented or they are interpreted. We will not support them the way you wrote them, and we will not support them if you try to fix them. That's the New York State Teachers Union. But we can do better than that. How about the whole NEA? How about the largest teachers union in the country? How about the National Education Association? Now let me give you a point about them. Now that the UAW has been wrecked, this is the single most political union we have in the country. They spend more, the teachers union spends more on political lobbying and activism than any union in the country. When my governor, Scott Walker, got recalled for taking on the teachers unions, that union spent $150 million of taxpayer dues to get him thrown out of office. The point being, this is not a right-wing organization. All of their donation money goes. They spend about $250 million a year on activism, all of it going to leftist causes. Here's what they said, and note the date, February of last year, 1 year ago. The nation's largest teachers union is pulling back on its once enthusiastic support for the Common Core academic standards, labeling the rollout, quote, completely botched, unquote. National Education President Association president, Dennis Van Roekel, said, quote, "The standards will not succeed without a major course correction that includes rewriting the standards and revising the tests with teacher input." Yeah, they're exactly right. Teachers didn't write the tests. 32 states and counting have now decided that the only way, the primary way, they're going to evaluate your teachers is how they perform on those tests, how the kids perform on those tests. Teachers didn't write the tests. Teachers don't get to grade the tests. The teachers learn nothing meaningful from the results of the test. See, that's the problem with things like Common Core. One big national standard for every American school kid. Are your kids all the same kid? Does anybody honestly believe one test is going to tell you anything meaningful about 60 million American school kids? And that's the second thing that makes the standards federal and not state or local. Who controls the tests? If the only way you have to measure Common Core is national tests, whoever controls those tests controls what goes on in the classroom. If your teachers' jobs are on the line about how their kids perform on these tests, what are your teachers going to have to do in the classroom? They're going to have to teach the tests, aren't they? And where do those tests, the results of those tests don't report back to California first. They all go to Washington, D.C. Go to the Capitol, Department of Education. Do you understand why the unions are doing this? The unions haven't had a come-to-Jesus moment. They're not a bunch of right-wingers now for opposing this. The unions have recognized that they no longer control their teachers' futures. The federal government does. As a teacher or a kid or a mom and dad, do you really trust the federal government more to determine what goes on in your kids' classrooms than you do your local teachers, your local administrators? When I say the only way to support teachers is to be against this, as a 22-year teacher, I want to be accountable. But you can't hold teachers accountable for tests they don't write, tests they don't get to see, tests the results of which they have nothing to do. The union tells you they weren't written by teachers. What kind of tests are they going to be if they weren't written by teachers or educational administrators or professionals at all? That's why the NEA is balking. Teacher input. And let's go, how about the second largest teachers union in the country? How about the American Federation of Teachers? Between the NEA and the AFT, that covers almost all your teachers. How about the AFT? The AFT, believe it or not, is considered to be the more liberal progressive of the two unions. And here's your date on this. July 2014, 8 months ago. In a major surprise, the American Federation of Teachers, the country's second largest teachers union, opened its convention by announcing a step back from support for Common Core. The AFT will now provide monetary grants for teachers to criticize the standards or even write new ones. Think about that. The AFT is paying teachers to criticize the standards. Think about what happens in a place like New York, just like California. In a place like New York, when the teachers union wants Common Core and the state wants it, shouldn't that bother you right there, by the way? When two such radically disparate organizations as the state government and the teachers union that are almost always fighting with each other, they both thought they wanted this. But if the union wants Common Core and your state wants Common Core, as is happening in California to the degree that you have unions, if you're a teacher who doesn't support Common Core, how do you speak out? Your union and your state employer doesn't like it, doesn't want you to speak out. Notice what happened in New York. In New York, when the union backed out of Common Core, teachers started speaking out by the tens of thousands. Why? Because if the state tried to fire them, the union now supports them. And the same thing would happen here. Am I saying that every single teacher would reject Common Core? Nope. But I bet you 50 to 60% of them would. In the 40 states I've been in, I must have talked to over 10,000 teachers, and they all tell me the same thing. If I get caught at a talk like this, I can be fired. I've got a file this thick at home with letters from superintendents and principals to teachers telling them things like, this is America, you have free speech, but not as long as you work for us. You will either support Common Core publicly or you will keep your mouth shut. We will tolerate no deviance from Common Core. Over and over again, they do this. Any system that starts that way isn't friendly to teachers. Right now, teachers who support it, they put microphones in front of their faces. But the ones who don't can't say it. In New York, when the union balked, they all started speaking out. Would happen here too. So, all right, the AFT's Executive Council also introduced a resolution declaring that the standards may have had noble intentions, but have fallen short due to outside meddling, Gates and Coleman, and an inordinate focus on standardized tests. Really? The only way to measure these are national tests. Do you know that last I calculated, about 35% of American school districts have already conceded that Common Core testing is so complicated, it takes so long, that they're not going to offer any other tests but the national tests. You understand what happened? You got American school districts that are no longer offering tests and quizzes based on what the teacher's teaching the kids. It's all defaulted now to the big national tests. Who's in control of your schools? And I'll walk back to Wisconsin. If you can tell me the last time the federal government took something over, couldn't deal with it, but then gave it back to the states. When did that ever happen? See, what's at stake here is, it's not even bigger than Common Core. The problem here, California, is when Common Core is fully implemented, it's all going to be regulated in Washington. And if it doesn't work, how do you get your schools back? Once you give that to the feds, you'll never get it back again. Do you really believe Washington bureaucrats better know how to educate your kids than your communities do? That's a heck of a bet. So the AFT concluded that it's fallen short due to meddling and testing. This is one of my favorites. Common Core has also seen other opposition from the left wing as well, particularly from a new faction of almost 100,000 left-wing teachers who have named themselves the Badass Teachers Association. That's the name they gave themselves. The Badass Teachers are a group of leftist progressive teachers, and by the way, that was a year ago. There are 170,000 of them now. The Badass Teachers formed precisely to fight Common Core. Do you know that in cities across this country, the Badass Teachers are standing arm in arm with Tea Party activists to fight this? And why? Because both the left and the right agree on one important thing, that the people who suffer most from Common Core are special needs kids, inner city minority kids, kids who are already behind. If you're going to do a one-size-fits-all standard, those kids are doomed. That's where the left and the right and the Badass Teachers are fighting this collectively. All right. This happens to be my personal favorite. How about the City of Chicago's Teachers Union? How about President Obama's own backyard? How about them? That woman that you see on the screen, that's Karen Lewis, the president of the Chicago Teachers Union. She, by the way, has just gotten sick. She got cancer. But before she did, she was going to run for mayor of Chicago. And are you ready? She was going to run to the left of Rahm Emanuel. See, I didn't think you could get anything to the left of Rahm Emanuel, maybe some dryer lint, but she's not running anymore. And if you talk to Mrs. Lewis, she is, by her own definition, a socialist. She considers herself a Marxist socialist. She's the president of the CTU. Here is, and notice the date here, May of 2014. What I'm about to read you is a direct quote from Karen Lewis. I agree with educators and parents from across the country. The Common Core mandate represents an overreach of federal power into personal privacy, that's the data mining, and an overreach of federal power into state educational autonomy. Can I just one more time put my English professor hat on? Word for the day is irony. I'll use it in a sentence. It is ironic that a socialist sees Common Core as too much government interventionism, isn't it? What does that tell you if Karen Lewis says, this is way too much government? It gets into your personal business. It gathers data, information on your kids, and markets it and collects it to third parties and to government agencies. It also strips away the power of local communities to have any meaningful say in how their kids are educated, so says Karen Lewis. How about this quote? Common Core eliminates creativity in the classroom and impedes collaboration. Any teachers here today? All right, you tell me if I'm lying. You hold me accountable. As a 22-year teacher myself, aren't there times when you walk into the classroom and you got 25 kids looking at you with blank stares? The best teachers are the ones that sometimes throw the book out, set the curriculum aside, and figure out how to teach that kid sitting in front of them. How do you do that when the whole thing is scripted in Washington? How do you do it when the whole thing is dependent on tests that are standardized? You can't do that. That's why the unions are balking. Teachers, Common Core eliminates creativity in the classroom and impedes collaboration. You ready for this? We also know that high-stakes standardized tests are designed to rank and sort our children, and they contribute significantly to racial discrimination and the achievement gap in American schools. And she's right. Karen Lewis presides over inner-city Chicago schools. They're underfunded, they're broken down, nobody cares, nobody wants to teach there. Those kids have no prayer with this nonsense. She's right. What do these tests tell you? One-size-fits-all, big national tests tell you nothing. Tell your teachers not one thing that will help them teach those kids. Nothing. Why are you selling your soul, California, to Washington for standards that are meaningless? And I'll show you what I mean by meaningless before we're done. I'll show you the research. Not only did Karen Lewis say that, but the entire Chicago Teachers Union wrote 30 different anti-Common Core resolutions. I can't read you all of them, I'll just read you a couple. The CTU resolution declares that, quote, instructional and curriculum decisions should be in the hands of classroom professionals who understand the contexts and interests of their students. What a revolutionary idea. Let educators educate. Wow. But that wasn't done with Common Core. Instructional and curriculum decisions should be in the hands of classroom professionals who understand the context and interests of their students, and, quote, the education of children should be grounded in developmentally appropriate practice. The first people telling you that Common Core is inappropriate developmentally for little kids is the Chicago Teachers Union. How about this? Common Core standards were designed by non-practitioners, non-teachers, including test and curriculum publishers. Now there's what we got going on here. Who did this? Among the people who did this and are responsible for the tests are the tests and curriculum publishers. Now let me ask you a question. And you, again, teachers, you tell me if I'm wrong about this. Take math. We've been teaching math to little kids the same way for 2,000 years. Nothing has changed. There is nothing new in math for kids from 5-year-old to 15-year-old. Have we invented a new number that I don't know about? Is there a new geometrical shape that somebody slipped into geometry class? I get that for the kids in calculus, things advance, but not for little kids, not for kids from 11th grade down to 5 years old. And if that's true, you should be able to buy one math textbook and use it for 60 years. But see, if you do that, who's not going to make any money? Textbook companies. And when did all this get started? How about the late 1970s, when we created the Department of Education? If you look at the arc of American academic achievement from the year 1900 to the year 1975, our kids are going up, 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 vis-a-vis the rest of the world, almost every year. What happened in the late 1970s? Why did we need a Department of Education? We put a man on the moon with less technology than the phone in your cell pocket right now. NASA had less technology than your cell phone, and they put a man on the moon. Who was it in the 1970s that decided that our kids were failing? I guarantee you that in the late 1970s, I was alive. Teachers didn't say, son of a gun, our kids are stupid all of a sudden. Moms and dads didn't say, oh my God, our schools are failing and my kids don't know anything. Your universities, like the one I teach at, they weren't turning your kids away. Who decided that the schools were failing? Well, for some reason, we created the multi-billion-dollar-a-year Department of Education. And immediately, the Federal Department of Education had to justify why all those billions of dollars that used to go directly to the states to help with education went first to the Department of Education. So what did your Department of Education do? They hired test companies and textbook companies like Pearson and McGraw-Hill to create big national exams. And guess what those exams proved? Your kids were failing, your teachers were failing, your schools were failing, the textbooks were failing. So what happened? You had to throw it all out and buy their stuff. Have you noticed since the 1970s, every 4 or 5 years we throw everything out and start over again? Why? Math hasn't changed, has it? Yet that's what's happening, because somebody's got to buy textbooks from these people. Let me give you an example. Pearson Publishing. Pearson Publishing, an English firm, they own 100% of the Canadian textbook market. You can't buy a school book in Canada that's not Pearson's. Pearson currently owns 84% of the American textbook market. Do you know that your federal government, a couple years ago, gave Pearson Publishing the exclusive contract to create, publish, and score the exams? Pearson Publishing makes $30 for every exam your kids take. What's 30 times 60 million? That's a big deal, isn't it? Your federal government was legally obligated. Every time the feds give a contract, they have to do a bid by law. They can't just award people contracts. Your government did not bid this out. They just gave it to Pearson. Even better than that, last year alone, your federal government paid Pearson Publishing $350 million to create the tests and textbooks that they would have created anyway. Pearson turned around and sold those tests to states like California, and they kept all the money from it. This is what's called crony capitalism. It's not open to everybody. This is the federal government picking a few small companies to get in bed with them and to get rich. That's what's happening there. That's a big deal, isn't it? Crony capitalism. And let's just step back for a second. Remember my little Gates analogy. If it were the Koch brothers, wouldn't we be asking what the Koch brothers are getting out of this? Wouldn't we be demanding to know what's the quid pro quo? You Koch brothers, you're just not giving that $6 billion out of the goodness of your heart. What do you get? Has anybody asked that about Gates? No. It's been estimated, conservatively, that 70% of American schools, 70, are going to have to upgrade their computer technology a lot to be able to handle the kind of testing that Common Core requires. And do you know where all that upgrade has to come? In inner city schools, mostly minority schools, and in rural schools, poor white schools. In other words, the schools that can least afford to upgrade are the ones that are going to have to do it. Whose computers do you think are going in all those schools? Do you think Apple got that contract? But that's what happened. And so the CTU resolution continues. Common Core standards were developed by non-practitioners, including test and curriculum publishers and education reform foundations, like the Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation, ALEC, Achieve, Inc., all these 501c3 education companies that are funded by people like George Soros and Bill Gates, the purpose of which is not to educate your children better, but to politicize their education. They're the ones who did this. Gates being at the forefront. Who makes money off this? You'd ask it if it were Republicans doing it, wouldn't you? If it were Kochs instead of Gates. As a result, Chicago says, these standards better reflect the interests and priorities of corporate education reformers than the best interests and priorities of our nation's children. That's true. Well, beyond Chicago, how about this? This is the editor of Salon magazine, one of our most progressive liberal news magazines. The editor, Mr. Mazenko, July of last year, writes we're working our way through the lies of Common Core. How many of you have heard this one? As far as I'm concerned, this is the single most dangerous lie the Common Core people tell you. How many of you have heard it said that Common Core is just a set of standards, it's not curriculum? How many? Oh, yeah. That can't be true. Your teachers went home a fine June morning when the semester ended. They went home for the summer. They came back the following fall, and all their textbooks had vanished. In their place were new Common Core textbooks, or no textbooks at all, just uploads from Pearson Publishing. How did your teachers learn how to teach Common Core? There was no other, the only thing they had was the textbooks. The only things they had were the materials that were handed to them. Who made those materials? Most of them were made by Pearson. Pearson was in the room with the Common Core people, putting the textbooks together exactly to meet the standards. You can't separate them. They're the same thing. And don't listen to me. Let's let Mr. Mazenko, who has the proper liberal qualifications, let's let him tell you what happened. Here's what Mr. Mazenko says. The underreported story about Common Core is the millions of dollars to be made in developing and selling educational materials and tests linked to the new standards. Listen carefully to what he says. Despite claims by Common Core advocates that standards are not curriculum, school districts are realizing they need to spend money on new materials and training to meet the new standards, especially if schools are required to use standardized tests. And they all are. Without a doubt, the implementation of Common Core will cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And the US Department of Education has already paid companies like Pearson $350 million to create and develop curriculum and tests. Clearly, the Common Core has been incredibly lucrative for certain businesses, while the benefits to students remain dubious at best. Right? What do you got going on here? You got an out-of-control federal government taking things over, and you got a small group of companies being handpicked by that government to get rich off it. That seems to be the case. Take it up with Michael Mazenko at Salon.com. And this is big. I want you to notice the date on this. 2 months ago, sorry. January 24th, 2015. Exactly 2 months ago. You know what happened 2 months ago? The entire Washington State Democrat Party called for an immediate pullout of Common Core. And if I didn't tell you what I'm about to read you was from the Democrat Party of Washington, you'd think a Tea Party wrote this. Listen to what the Democrats said. The Central Committee of the Washington State Democrat Party has passed a resolution roundly condemning Common Core standards. This is the first time that a statewide Democrat Party committee has taken a public position against the Core, and it happened in the backyard of Bill Gates, whose money funded this national standards project. I'm going to read you the Democrat resolution, and keep in mind that in Washington State, you have a Democrat governor, a Democrat Senate, and a Democrat Assembly. What this means is if you want to run in Washington State as a Democrat, you have to accept and adopt this platform, or you will get no support and no money from the state Democrat caucus. That's what that means. Here is their resolution. Whereas the copyrighted and therefore unchangeable Common Core state standards are a set of controversial, top-down K-12 academic standards that were promulgated by wealthy private interests without any research-based validity. They were never tested, and are developmentally inappropriate at the youngest grade levels. And whereas, as a means of avoiding the US Constitution's 10th Amendment prohibition against federal meddling in state education, can I just pause and marvel and wonder when you have Democrats citing the Constitution? You got socialists calling Common Core too much government involvement. You got Democrat state parties defaulting to the Constitution to fight this. How do you call this right wing? Because that's the only argument they got. Because if we break up this silly right wing argument and get back to looking after our kids, you'll see that this may be the only issue in this country today that the right and the left agrees on. Whereas, let me keep whereasing you here. I'm going to go back to the Constitution. Whereas, as a means of avoiding the US Constitution's 10th Amendment prohibition against meddling in state education policy, two unaccountable private trade organizations, the National Governors Association and the CCSSO, have received millions of dollars in funding from the Gates Foundation and others to write Common Core. And whereas the US Department of Education, the federal Department of Education, improperly pressured state legislatures to accept the Common Core and the high-stakes tests that accompany them as a condition for competing for federal race-to-the-top money, money that should have gone to the states based on need, not blackmail. And whereas implementation of Common Core will cost local school districts hundreds of millions of dollars to pay for standardized computer-based tests, new technology, curricula, teacher training, at a time when Washington is already underfunding K-12 education. and without any proven benefit to students. And whereas states across the Union have begun to try to pull out from Common Core, therefore, be it resolved that we call upon the Washington State Legislature and the Superintendent of Public Instruction to withdraw from the Common Core and keep K-12 education student-centered and accountable to the people of Washington State. Now that's a big deal, isn't it? And please tell me, what does Washington State know that you don't? What do the Washington State Democrats know that you don't know? Do you want your education accountable to the state, accountable to the teachers, accountable to the parents of the state, or do you want the government to do it? Everything I just told you for 35 minutes, they just said. You got a beef with what I'm telling you, take it up with them. This is serious stuff. And then you got this. California, note the date, January 29th, 2015, 2 months ago. Did you know that your school districts in California are now suing your state? Because it's going to cost your state billions of dollars a year to take these tests. And the states can't afford it. So guess who the state's suing? The people who brought it here, the state. But you understand what I mean. Who's going to have to pay for this, California? You are. 2 months ago, here it is. The state of California could be liable for as much as $1 billion a year in costs if a group of school districts succeed in winning reimbursement expenses associated with the implementation of computer-based tests in the Common Core and other new state standards. 4 united school districts, Santa Ana, Vallejo, Plumas, and Porterville, and the Plumas County Office of Education filed a claim to classify the new tests as state mandates. Of course they are. Why do your kids have to take these dumb tests? Because your state says so. Because somebody in the Department of Education took some money somewhere down the line, you're stuck with the standards. They're going to win this. Your state of California can't adopt this nonsense and then tell the schools you have to pay for it. The state did it. If the Commission on State Mandates agrees, the state will be required to reimburse all districts statewide seeking costs. The districts contend that unlike the old pencil and paper exams, the new computer-based tests require districts to buy computers. Whose computers? Oh yes, that innocent, wonderful philanthropist, Bill Gates, requires the states to buy computers, expand their internet bandwidth capacity, install wireless connections, hire additional computer technicians, and train other district staff. And that's all well and good if you're in the Santa Ana School District, right, which has a good deal of money. But what if you are an inner city school that has a hard time keeping the lights and plumbing working? How are you going to pay for this? You're not, and that's part of the problem. The districts are suing for this now. So the 4 school districts, we listed them, right? In its filing, Santa Ana, the biggest of the 4 districts with about 50,000 students, said it is expecting to spend about $12 million last year, 12 more this year, on devices and bandwidth expansion, including $124,000 just on staff time. The district said it has not even determined training costs. The claim estimates the statewide costs for 2014, 2015 this year at about $1 billion. You put together all the money your state received for Common Core from the federal government, that supersedes it. So you got, I've seen different statistics and different ways the money's come to the state, but you didn't get $1 billion from the federal government for Common Core. One time, you didn't get that. But in 1 year, the cost of the tests alone, not talking about textbooks, the cost of the tests alone are going to cost more than you got for accepting it. And what are you getting for your return? Who controls you now, California? And notice how the schools can't sue the federal government. They sue the state, which means you're on the hook. Taxed enough yet, Colorado? California? All right. All right, keep going. I've been all over the place. It's getting a little blendy, although messing up California and Colorado is not good. Need a nap. And look, let me put another dagger in the heart of this is state-led. If Common Core is really state-led, then shouldn't states be able to walk away from it without penalty? If the states did this, States should be able to walk away. But what's happening at the federal government level to states that try to pull out of Common Core? They're getting hammered. They're getting states were bribed to take it, as I just showed you, and they're being blackmailed if they try to get out of it. I'll give you one example, and notice this from 2 months ago, January 31st, 2015. Feds threatened to take away $1 billion in school funding from Illinois. So I explained to you what happened. The city of Chicago has decided they're only going to offer these ridiculous tests to just 10% of their students. Every other school district in Illinois is giving the test to every single student. So it is alone in Illinois is Chicago. They only want to give it to 10% of their students. And the federal government said, you either give our tests to all your students or we will withhold your entire education budget. That's blackmail. Please tell me how it's not state-led when the feds, please tell me how it is state-led, when the feds bribed states to take it and are now absolutely decimating states that want out of it. Chicago Public Schools' decision to administer new Common Core exams to only about 10% of the city's 600 schools could cost the state over $1 billion in federal aid. In a recent letter to Illinois School Superintendent Christopher Koch, from U.S. Education Secretary Assistant Deborah Delisle made it clear that the state would lose as much as $1.17 billion in federal education funding next year if Chicago schools don't comply with Common Core testing requirements. The federal government said, you either take our tests or we give you no money. That's blackmail. It's not state-led. For finishing the article, now listen to this. That money, $1.17 billion that the feds give Illinois, that money represents about 84% of the state's federal aid for the year, and about $1 in $10 spent in Illinois on education. Think about that. Federal government's going to withhold $1 billion. That is less than 1% of the state's entire less than 7% of the state's entire education budget. Do you know how much more your states are spending? And Illinois' spending dwarfs California. Why are you selling your soul for what amounts to about 6% of 1 year's education budget? You are the land of taxes. You know that, right? You could easily make up that 6% a year without having to go to the federal government. If you rejected all the federal government's money, it would be less than 7% of your annual budget. And for that 1 year, you've sold your kids down the river. Why? There's no purpose to it. But this is what they're doing, your federal government, blackmail and extortion. But don't listen to me. At least give me credit for that. I told you 6 dozen times not to trust me. I appreciate your listening, but don't trust me. Listen to the people who did this. Another lie. You ready for another lie? How many of you have heard that Common Core is internationally benchmarked? How many of you have heard that Common Core is rigorous? It's better than what we've had before. Please explain to me how you can know that when it's only now being tested for the first time. You've been told for 6 years this is superior to what we have. You've been told for 6 years it's been internationally benchmarked. You've been told for 6 years it's you've heard the word rigor so much, you've been rigor mortis to death here. But how can you prove it's rigorous when right now your kids are taking the first exams? It doesn't make any sense. So don't listen to me. That's Bill Gates. That's the man who bankrolled this. Listen to what he said 2 years ago.
It would be great if our education stuff worked, but that we won't know for probably a decade.
In 2013, Bill Gates said, it'd be nice to know if our education stuff's going to work, but we won't know for at least a decade. Your kids are guinea pigs. This wasn't benchmarked. It's never been tested. It's all a game. How can you call it rigorous? He doesn't even know if it's going to work. And what a cavalier attitude to be treating your children with. Remember No Child Left Behind, the George W. Bush mega disaster, followed up by the mega disaster that is Common Core? You don't know anything about this stuff. They don't know if it's going to work. Even better than that. Here you go. You want to make the argument that standards aren't curriculum? You want to make the argument that the standards are just these really benign things that teachers can get at any way they want to? They have freedom? Well, listen to Mr. Gates all the way back in 2009.
We'll only know if this effort has succeeded when the curriculum and tests are aligned to these standards. Secretary Arne Duncan recently announced that $350 million of the stimulus package will be used to create just these kinds of tests, next generation assessments aligned to the Common Core. When the tests are aligned to the common standards, the curriculum will line up as well.
You understood that, right? When are the tests aligning with the standards? Right now. When the tests align to the standards, the curriculum lines up as well. We control the tests. Your teachers are evaluated on the tests. Your teachers will have to teach what we tell them and only what we tell them. Where's your freedom? How can you be for this and claim you support the teachers? They're being evaluated by tests they didn't write, don't get to see. You've heard what they said. Oh, let me make you mad. This right here is David Coleman. That's our boy right there. The man who has no educational background, no experience. The man who is the architect of this, and no sooner did he do this nonsense, now he's rewriting your SATs, right? Without any educational experience. Listen to what he said about the lie that your teachers are free to teach any way they want, and you can walk into any school district in this state tomorrow, talk to the superintendent, the principal, they'll tell you, we're a local control state. That's my superintendent voice. We're a local control state. You can teach any way you want. Okay, listen to the guy who wrote the standards. You ready?
Which is teachers will teach towards the test. There is no force strong enough on this earth to prevent that. There's no amount of hand-waving. There's no amount of saying they teach to the standards, not the test. We don't do that here, whatever.
I think he's mocking you. He's not even an American citizen anymore. There's no force in the whole world that can stop your teachers from teaching to our tests the way we want them to. Who controls your kids' education? Ain't the state, ain't the teachers, it certainly ain't you, mom and dad. It's this guy and his tests. I'm gonna play that one more time because I want it to resonate with you, because you'll go to the schools tomorrow and they'll look you in the eye and they'll tell you our teachers are free to teach what they want. Listen to this one more time.
Which is teachers will teach towards the test. There is no force strong enough on this earth to prevent that. There's no amount of hand-waving. There's no amount of saying they teach to the standards, not the test. We don't do that here, whatever.
There's no way you can say our teachers teach to the standards. He just told you that. Your teachers teach what we want them taught. These are people who did this, right? Pretty shocking. I urge you to go to the Center for Teacher Quality. This is 2015, February 2015. They did a very and you can see all their data. They did a very comprehensive data analysis going all across the country, trying to measure grade by grade how much time is going to be spent testing for Common Core. This is fourth grade. The average fourth grader is going to spend 51 days of a 180-day school year testing. 51 days of non-education, 51 days of testing in a 180-day school. And fourth grade isn't even a major testing year. Third grade's an even bigger one. And this raises a fundamental issue. Every state in the union requires schools to have a certain number of contact hours between teachers and students. Test days aren't contact hours. Your schools are in violation of your own state constitution when it comes to education, because they're not teaching your kids as many hours as they should be because of the stupid testing. That's already happening. And then you got this. And I am going to give you, we're going to finish this, I'm going to give you a little 5-7 minute break so you can take a pee break. The second half of this talk is much quicker. We'll give you a break, you come back, we'll spend 35-40 minutes, and we're going to talk about the standards specifically. But before you do, you need to know this. We've had 50 different academic studies done in the last 40 years. Ever since the Department of Education was created, we've had 50 different highly researched studies done at universities on what effect state standards and federal standards have on your kids' education. Do you know what every single study has concluded? There is no relationship whatsoever between a state standard or a federal standard in your kid's performance. Not one bit. Have whatever standards you want at the state. Have whatever standards you want at the national level. They don't impact your kid's education one bit, not one iota. They are meaningless. So why are we spending so much money on them, so much time, so much control? They don't work. I'm dead serious. You look at American achievement in school up until about the time of the Department of Ed, we're doing really quite well. And the minute the Department of Ed takes over and nationalizes the test to prove that they're in control, your kid's performance goes sailing down. The tests prove nothing. This is the Brown Center Report on American Education. This is the most comprehensive study 2 years ago ever done on the relationship between state and federal standards and what goes on in your classrooms. The study is produced by the Brookings Institute, a left-leaning think tank. You can go online and type this in. You can watch all their data. I'm only going to read you the final paragraph. Are you ready? Here's the final paragraph. What effect will the Common Core have on national achievement? The analysis presented here suggests very little impact. The quality of the Common Core standards is currently being hotly debated, but the quality of all past curriculum standards has been unrelated to student achievement. The rigor of performance standards, how high you set the bar for proficiency at the state and federal level, is unrelated to student achievement. You know the dirty little secret here? Why did America become a superpower? Back when we became one, a huge percentage of American kids learned in one-room schoolhouses. It's an amazing thing. The only standard that has ever really proven to work when educating children is you need 3 things. You need a committed parent, you need a disciplined child, and you need an effective teacher. That's your standard. Every step beyond that you go weakens education. And we get to the Department of Education, and all the standards suddenly bump from the classroom up to the districts, and it watered them down. Then in the 80s and 90s, the standards got bumped up to the state level, and it watered down education more. And now it's at the federal level, where it's completely watered down. You could not get farther away from what works, that little triad, unless the United Nations were to take over education. And I know you laugh at that, but I'm telling you to verify this. Bill Gates, in 2004, as a private citizen, signed a mutual cooperation agreement with UNESCO, the United Nations education arm, to do precisely this, and to bring it beyond American shores. This is not meant to be Common Core, just an American thing. It is the objective of people like Gates to have every kid in every school in the world learning the same thing at the same day, the same way. Go look up his agreement pact. By the way, UNESCO, the United Nations Education Wing. Does anybody know when the United Nations founded UNESCO in the 40s? Does anybody know what their first motto was, UNESCO? Your kids are our kids. That's the United Nations. This is a big deal. The point you need to take away from this is they don't work. The standards are utterly meaningless as to what goes on in your kid's classroom. The tests are equally meaningless. You want to get back to educating kids correctly, empower teachers at a very local level to figure out what their kids need and to do what it takes to get them where they have to be. That's it. Nothing else works. And yet we're as far away from that as you can now get. If you have, and a young lady came up to me before the talk today and gave me showed me a piece of paper about what's going on in her school. If you have, and some of you have suggested this as well, if you have examples of outrageous things that are going on in your kids' schools with regards to Common Core, please let some of the folks here know, because the more of that we gather, the stronger our case to go to the school board is. So if you see your kids suffering under this, please let these folks know. I'm going back to frigid Wisconsin on Sunday, but they're going to be here to continue to help you. One more thing. I know what's going to happen. When we're done, the first question you're going to ask is, what do we do about this? And I want to take to prime the pump a little bit. In the very back of the room, we've got Brad Dacus. He's an attorney with the Pacific Justice Institute. As soon as I'm done, he's going to come up and join me. We're going to take questions, and I'm leaving, but this man is amazing. He's from an organization called Pacific Justice. They are a conglomeration of lawyers who are working free of charge. They donate their services to help you if you get into trouble in the schools, or if you protest or want to opt your kids out of Common Core and you run into trouble. they will help you legally. And so it's a huge resource. They're helping moms and dads all across the country, but they're really big here in your part of the woods. So I'm going to bring Brad down at the end, and I want you to meet him. And he's really fantastic because you have got great resources here. So if you do have anything going on in your school, let us know. Brad's here to talk about that and what you as moms and dads can do to begin to fight back in this state. So thank you for your patience. I'll go back to the talk now. And we'll, let's talk about these standards, shall we? Before I start talking to you about the standards, I want to say this. It absolutely matters how we got this. Even if you think, as you sit here right now, you still like the standards, you like national standards, you like national tests, how do you countenance the way this came about? This has been utterly a coup. You've never been consulted about this. You were never asked. Your state wasn't consulted except for the people at the top who took it. Legislature wasn't involved in this. The governors weren't involved in this. Teachers unions weren't consulted about any of this. This is a takeover. Whatever you think of standards and national standards and these ridiculous tests, how do we accept that this was done this way? There's all sorts of evidence I'm about to show you why these standards are going to be a nightmare and what their main objective is. So let's start that here. You need one last little history lesson, and I'll stop giving you history lessons. Back in 2013, 2012, 2011, after the standards were finally written, the Common Core did something you might be tempted to see as a good idea. The Common Core people hired 29 people from around the country to go to Washington, D.C. and to evaluate the standards. They called this group of people the Validation Committee. This outside committee was given absolute carte blanche. They could throw the standards out, they could rewrite them, they could approve them, whatever they wanted to do. Interestingly, in this committee of 29, there was only one person who had any math experience at the national level, one. There was only one English person who had any experience writing national and state standards. That was it. Two experts, one in math, one in English. The math expert is a person right here from California. He's a retired Stanford University math professor by the name of James Milgram. He is a very, very serious mathematician. Much of the mathematics that was used to get us to the moon in the late 1960s, he wrote it as a young man. One of the 22 most important mathematicians in the country. James Milgram said of Common Core, and I quote, "Get rid of it. It is an absolute joke to think that Common Core math is going to prepare your kids for four-year college math or for STEM careers. It's not. STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math careers. It's not going to prepare your kids for those." He said, get rid of them at once. The English specialist is a woman by the name of Dr. Sandra Stotsky. She's a retired University of Arkansas professor, and she is considered one of the foremost experts on English language arts development in the world. Sandy, like Jim lives here, Sandy's been to your state at least 6 times, trying to warn your legislatures to stop this. She, the only English expert with national standard experience, she said, and I quote, "Get rid of them. These standards in English writing and comprehension are going to set your kids 3 years behind the 3 years they're already behind the high-achieving countries in this area. Get rid of them." Sandy and Jim convinced other people on the committee to vote no. Do you know what the Common Core people did? They just blacked their names out of the report. They just cut them out of the final report, and they validated with the people remaining. This is fact, and you can find it out easily. And that's why Stotsky and Milgram are doing exactly what I'm doing. They're traveling the country, warning you about this, and these were the guys they paid to evaluate it. Having said that, this is directly from Sandy Stotsky. And as an English professor, it makes perfect sense to me. What's wrong with the English language arts standards? Well, for starters, at every grade level, Common Core lowers the overall level of reading that kids do by 50% and elevates the writing by 50%. Your kids are now writing twice as much in every grade as they're reading. And if your kids aren't reading things, what are they writing about? Every metric for the last 400 years has shown that kids learn how to write well only after they learn how to read well. And if your kids aren't reading much of anything, but they're writing a whole lot, what are they writing about? Maybe that's how examples like the one from my state of Wisconsin a couple years ago, where 3rd graders, little 8-year-olds, were sent home and told to write an essay on how the state is just like the family, but better. And as Sandy points out, you're going to get much more indoctrination now. Besides the writing-reading split, which is educationally disastrous, we are also pulling out Common Core mandates that a minimum of 50% of the literature that your kids used to read in English class is being removed in favor of what Common Core calls informational texts, most of which come directly from the federal government. So they're taking literature out of English class and they're putting very one-sided political pamphlets from the government in its place. I'll show you some examples in a moment. Now let's stop for a second. Why do your kids read literature in English class? One, I just told you why, because kids learn how to read through stories. When you put your kids to bed at night, your grandkids to bed at night, why do you read them stories? You read them stories that get them all worked up, don't you? Get their little eyelids fluttering and their heart pumping. When you put your kids to bed, you're actually stimulating them. If you want them to fall asleep, wouldn't you read them a Bill Gates computer manual? I mean, which would work, right? But you don't do that. Because you may not have a lot of university educational experience, but you know that kids learn to read through storytelling. The stories are being pulled out of Common Core. In fact, there's a great book by a Hillsdale College professor that just came out. It's called The Story Killers: How Common Core Destroys Kids' Reading of Stories. There's a reason for it we'll talk about. I should also mention while I'm doing this, to keep with my theme, my non-tinfoil hat theme, both Sandy Stotsky and Jim Milgram are lifelong Democrat voters. They're not Republicans, if that matters to you, right? They're doing the same thing we're doing. And so what you got here, as Sandy puts on the board, why do we read the classics? When your 9th grader reads Shakespeare, nobody has any idea how Shakespeare would have voted on illegal immigration. When your 12th grader reads Jane Austen, nobody knows how Jane Austen would have voted on green energy. When you read the classics, you're reading for big issues, not politics. You're reading for issues of love, truth, justice, peace, war. In fact, when you read the great classics, particularly the great Judeo-Christian classics of the last 2,000 years, you're studying things like characters, ethics, morality. But that's being gone, Sandy rightly points out, and it's being replaced with one-sided political discourse. That's a problem. More indoctrination within text, less actual genuine reading, and more informational text, less classic literature. Here are some of those informational texts that are being put in your kids' English class in place of literature. By the time your daughter's a freshman in high school, she will be exposed to things like this: recommended levels of insulation, a report released in 2010 by the EPA and the Department of Energy. I've read it. It's a 50-page regulatory manual of the environmentally correct way to insulate new buildings. It's not a story, it's not a narrative, it's just a list of government regulations. Sandy estimates, and she's right, about 35% of the informational texts that are replacing literature in your kids' class deal exclusively with global warming. All from the perspective that it's happening, no doubt, and America's destroying the planet. As Sandy points out, this isn't critical thinking. Critical thinking is when you expose kids to multiple arguments and you let them make up their own mind. This is one-sided government intervention on certain policy principles that the feds want. How about by the time your son's in 10th grade? And now remember, this is English class, it's not science class. By the time your son's in 10th grade, they're going to be reading things like President Obama's own executive orders from the White House. Executive Order 13423, strengthening federal environmental, energy, and transportation management. Again, EPA global warmingism. A long essay for 10th graders on the evolution of the grocery bag. Spoiler alert, in case you want to go out and get that little gem. It's all about how paper and plastic are both bad and America's destroying the planet. That essay, by the way, was a major contributor to your state's decision to ban plastic bags across the state. You see what's happening? Literature, neutral topics, big issues, ethics, morality, being pulled out of your kid's classroom, and it's being replaced with very one-sided, tendentious politics. And then there's this. This is really shocking. Now, remember what you heard in the first half of this talk. It wasn't me. It was the Washington State Democrats. It wasn't me. It was the Chicago Teachers Union who first told you that Common Core English is developmentally inappropriate for kids. It's unacceptable. What do they mean? Stuff like this. Of that little literature that's left in Common Core, why is so much of it shockingly sexually graphic, inappropriate for kids. Here's but one example. This is Toni Morrison's book, The Bluest Eye. Toni Morrison is a fantastic writer. She's an African-American novelist, a Nobel Prize winner in literature, but we wouldn't assign this book to freshmen in college. It's about a 12-year-old girl who is the victim of rape and incest. And over the course of the book, she comes to bond with her rapist, and she writes graphically about their sexual encounters in shocking terms. This book has been pulled out of Common Core classrooms for kids as young as middle school, 8th graders. You can't see it, it's probably a good thing. I took some passages from the book, put them in the slide, and blocked out all the bad words. We don't have any little kids here, but I would feel more comfortable if you can't read that and would like to see the level of pornography that little middle school kids are reading, you got to come up and look afterwards. There are about 36 books at the high school level alone that contain this shocking level of graphic violence and sex, including books like Dreaming in Cuban, including books like Black Swan. Over and over again, the question becomes, why is there so much of this in Common Core? Literature has been reduced to a secondary thought. Stories have been pulled out, but what stories remain, they're either violent or apocalyptic or they're highly sexualized. Why is that? And it's not just the high school kids. The high school kids, of course, get the more intense sexuality. But even our young kids, even our 3rd graders, for instance, this is a Common Core assignment for a 3rd grade kid, an 8-year-old. It's actually a decent English assignment. You give the kid a paragraph or a page to read, you send him home. His job is to read the assignment and then answer some questions. Who is the main character in the story? What is the main theme of the story? That's a great assignment until the Common Core folks get a hold of it. Here's an example of an 8-year-old, a 3rd grader's. Here's the question the kid had to come home with. Ready? Oh, and by the way, notice how mom scratched out the assignment and said, inappropriate. I'm not explaining this to an 8-year-old. Here's the paragraph. Ruby sat on the bed she shared with her husband, holding a hair clip. There was something mysterious and powerful about the cheaply manufactured neon clip that she was holding in her newly suspicious palms. She didn't recognize the hair clip. It was too big to be their daughter's, and Ruby was sure that it wasn't hers. She hadn't had friends over in weeks, and here was this hair clip, little and green, with a few long black strands of hair in it. Ruby ran her fingers through her own blonde hair. She had just been vacuuming when she noticed this small, bright green object under the bed. Now their life would never be the same. She would wait here until her husband, Michael, returned home. And the only way you get the right answer is if you identify the main topic of that assignment is dad's having an adulterous affair in mom's bed. That's the point of it. I'll show you more of these. But it strains credulity to think that we're doing this. I can simply say this. Go home and type into Google, sexualized Common Core lessons. You'll find 1,000 of these. They're all over the place. As Sandy Stotsky says, why in the world, with everything in the world that your kids could read and all that great literature, why are they replacing it with this stuff? There's an answer for that, but I don't quite think we're ready to go there. And as far as the math goes, this is a big one too. Professor Milgram, again, how many of you have heard the lie that Common Core math is internationally benchmarked? It never has been. The first thing that Milgram did when he got to the Common Core Math Committee, he says, okay, you say that you've tested this math against all the other countries. Show me what countries you measured it against. And they handed him a list, and the list had all the right countries on it, places where math is done really well, like Sweden and South Korea and Taiwan. And so Professor Milgram said, great, now show me your math. How did you do it? The entire time that committee met, nobody ever presented any evidence. They refused to present any evidence. As a matter of fact, 6 years into Common Core, nobody anywhere has ever seen any evidence that this has been measured. You heard Bill Gates, we won't know for 10 years. So Milgram said that it wasn't done. As a matter of fact, 1 year ago, after 5 years of bragging about it, the Common Core website at the national level quietly pulled the claim off the website. They no longer even advertise it benchmarked. It never happened. It's all a big lie. And so, when talking to Professor Milgram, we brought Milgram and Stotsky into Wisconsin. They testified for hours before the our Senate Select Committee on Common Core. Milgram gave 3 hours of data and analysis about how this curriculum was going to destroy math education in this country. Among other things, he said, the problem with Common Core math is, at the very youngest ages, it's developmentally inappropriate. You're asking little kids to do things they can't do. But by the time elementary school is over, you're getting so much little math after that by the time your kids get to high school, they're way behind. I'll give you an example. In every high-achieving math country on earth, all of them, kids routinely start serious algebra in 7th grade or even 6th grade. In No Child Left Behind America, our kids didn't even start serious algebra till 8th grade, and Common Core pushes the study of algebra into high school. Your kids won't start algebra till 9th grade, and if that's true, as Milgram rightly points out, if you're not starting algebra in 9th grade, your kids will not get calculus and advanced math in the high schools. Over 40 different American school districts and counting have already pulled calculus off of the high school offerings. And somebody pointed out to me, there's one here. Is it Long Beach? I'll find out what it was. There's already one school district here that's done it, that they're eliminating calculus from the high school because your kids won't get there. As Milgram says, where are your architects and your doctors and your engineers going to come from? So in asking him, all right, if this is not a math program designed to make kids do math well, what kind of math program is it? You know what his words were? This is social justice math. What do we mean by that? Not every kid can do math at a high level. Think about your own education. You were either really good at math or you weren't. It's one of those subjects where you get it or you don't. I never got it. But that's not fair, right? Why is it that so few kids can excel at math? That's not just. We've created a math curriculum where every kid gets comfortable doing a little bit of math, but nobody's allowed to do too much. That's the priority of the Common Core people. And what is that going to do to those kids who can legitimately do math? His evidence, among other things, and you can't make this stuff up. This is, Professor Milgram pointed this video out to us. The young woman in the video is a community organizer from the city of Chicago. And she's talking to a group of high school math teachers about the fundamental premise of Common Core math. Here's what she says.
But even under the new Common Core, even if they said 3 times 4 was 11, if they were able to explain their reasoning and explain how they came up with their answer really in words and in oral explanations, and they showed it in the picture, but they just got the final number wrong, we're really more focusing on the how.
That's it. And I don't want to be glib about this. I understand that kids learn differently. But what she said is exactly right. We are less concerned about right answers because not everybody can get them. Every kid can play with numbers, but not every kid can get the right answer. We're more concerned about the process. The primary way that elementary school math, the most important math, if you're going to be a mathematician later, you got to get the basics. The primary way that Common Core math is done at the elementary school is to put kids into groups of 2 and 3. Teachers don't teach them math. They hand the kids basic math problems. And the purpose of the assignment is not to get the right answer. It is to get all 3 kids to agree on what they think the answer is. This is the social justice component. It's community math. I'll give you an example. I actually have an exam from a 7-year-old in the state of New York. The question was 7 times 6. The little boy wrote 42. He got it marked wrong. The teacher said, the other 2 kids in your peer group agreed on a different answer. They got it right. You didn't agree with your peers, so you did not get it right. All sorts of examples of this. The purpose is, and you think about it, I mentioned to you that I was a bad math student. When I was in 3rd grade, I had a 2nd grade math ability. I sort of still do. I mean, I can balance a checkbook, I can leave a tip, although I always leave 20% because I can't figure out the 5. But I do all right? But by the same token, when I was in 3rd grade doing 2nd grade math, I was also reading at a high school level. And I was allowed to read high school books, even though my math was so bad. Maybe that's why I entered the high finance world of college English professor, right? Because I could read. But so what? Your kids aren't all the same kids. See, this is the problem with this, as Milgram rightly points out. This is the problem with one-size-fits-all education. Your kids all aren't the same size. Let's do the math for a moment that our schools won't do. You're going to get 60 million American school kids to exactly the same place in every subject. By definition, is that going to be a high place or a low place? It has to be. Analogy. Nobody in the NBA looks like me. It's not just socially. And I'm not a problem. You put me in the NBA, I will be perfectly content to be the 13th man. I'll wave a towel, wear a jumpsuit, and collect my $4 million minimum salary. But if you accommodate, you want to make the NBA available to everybody, what are you going to do to the overall quality of the play? You're not going to raise it. You're going to lower it. How is that not true for your school kids? And you think about this. Who thought it was a good idea to have one standard for every kid? Your kids aren't standard. Albert Einstein, 1927, quote, "You standardize cars, you don't standardize children. I don't want to live in a country that standardizes children." It doesn't make any sense. We've lost more gifted and talented education programs in the last 2 years than in the last 40 years combined. Because under these one-size-fits-all standards, nobody goes ahead. To go ahead of the other students is to be socially unjust. Everybody's going to do the same thing. This is a big problem, right? And so to give you an example of how the Common Core math works, also one of Jim Milgram's top 10 hits. The woman in this video, you never see her. The mom in this video is a university math professor. And she cannot help her 8-year-old daughter with her math homework. And so she puts the little girl at the board and has her work the math problem. You're going to get a sense of the fundamental flaws of Common Core math by watching this short video. And there's your difficult math problem for an 8-year-old. Add those 3 numbers, 1568, 1423,
So
and
what
680.
I want you to do is, can you solve that problem showing me the way that you learned how to solve it in school?
Okay.
And talk to me while you're solving it.
So we learned that a big square like this is 100. So we could make that 100 into a cube, which would make 1,000. So I'm going to do that.
So a square is 100, a cube then is 1,000.
So let's just say that's 1,000.
Mm-hmm.
And now we still have to do 500. Could make that into 5 sheets.
So you notice, right, nobody's adding anything. This is just what you have to do to get the first number on the board.
And we have 60, which are just lines of 10. 20. For her birthday.
Now you got to put the second number on the board.
1,000. 23 more. The dots represent 1.
Okay.
So now we have to add all of these together. So you could make 1,000. All of these together is 400. Now you need 600 more. So now I'm going to write the numbers down. So we have 1,000 plus, well, let's just say 3,000 because we have 3 cubes. 3,000 plus 100, 200, 300, 400. So now we can erase all these sheets and hundreds and tens and say. So we can just add, and that gives us a total of 3,763.
Okay. Now that problem you just solved took about 8 minutes.
Yeah, and
Okay.
that's what we're doing
Listen to
in
this.
school. But at home, I'm taught how to stack, and we're not allowed to do stacking in school. That's why we have to figure it out.
Core
after.
prohibits
Okay.
this.
So I'm going to stack these numbers, which is way easy.
You do that to get the answer, you'll get marked wrong. You are not allowed to do that. If you try to add
What are
something
you
together,
thinking? You're looking at your problems.
I got 2 different ones.
You got 2 different answers. What do you think happened?
Maybe I counted wrong.
Looks like you did the stacking correctly, and that took you about a minute.
So I think I did something messed up on this sheet.
What do you think happened?
Well, since since that way was more confusing.
That's a smart little girl. See, unlike me, that's a little girl who can do math. But do you see the utter counterintuitive way they have to do it? What do they mean, Chicago and the Washington State Democrats? What do they mean when they say this is developmentally inappropriate for kids? You're taking 6 and 7 and 8-year-olds, and you are not letting them deal with numbers as numbers. You are forcing little kids to substitute symbols for numbers. At that age, they are not abstract thinkers. They can't make that link. You're asking kids to substitute in ways that is inappropriate for kids that young. It's a problem. It took 8 minutes to do that assignment. 8 minutes to add 3 stupid numbers. When in stacking it, it took about 30 seconds. And I'm dead serious about that. If you arrive at answers by virtue of that way, you will get it marked wrong. Even if you, another thing Common Core prohibits, you are not allowed to memorize multiplication tables. No memorization. Even if you're multiplying 2 plus 2, you have to go to the rigor of drawing all that stuff out. And the other thing about it is it's never the same thing. If every time during Common Core math a cube was 1,000, I might be able to figure some of it out, but they change it all the time. And as Professor Milgram says, I get that some students are different kinds of learners. I get that some students are visual learners. But why do you prohibit doing it the obvious, intuitive way and force all kids to do it this arcane way? What is that going to do, he says, to the kids who intrinsically get math? It's going to destroy them, and it already is. We got university math professors and CPAs who can't help their 5th graders with their math homework. As Professor Milgram rightly points out, there is no logical reason you would do that unless you wanted to create a math paradigm that only the schools could help them with and not the parents. There is no other answer for it. That's what he means by social justice. Your kids belong to them, not to you, and they're going to be the only ones. You know, this is probably as good a place as any to bring it up. I don't know if you've been following the California news, but down in Encinitas, right, down near San Diego, they just approved a program. All the kids have tablets. They just approved a program where every time your kid logs onto his tablet, 300 facial recognition data points gather information on the face, so that the only way your kid can log on is if he looks at the pad and all of that computer processing recognizes 300 data points in his face. You know what the big feature is? If a mom or a dad picks up the tablet to see what the kid's doing, it automatically shuts off. The only person who can access that, and all of their we have that young lady over here just gave me a sheet in English class where there's no textbooks. In their new school, everything is uploaded to the tablet. That's what they're doing. Any mom and dad who wants to see what the kid is doing or reading or do the math that they're doing, the minute your mom picks it up, it shuts down and no way she can get into it. And they're boasting about it in Encinitas. This is a big deal, right? 300 data points. This is part of the data mining stuff that's going on with Common Core. And you think about that. You understand now why algebra waits until 9th grade? 8 minutes to do a stinking easy little addition problem. It's all about the commune. It's not about the math. It's all about making math equally painful for everybody. When I was a bad math student in 2nd grade, if you put me in a group of 2 other kids and we all had to agree on the right answer, I'm going to agree with the kid in the sweater vest and the glasses every single time, no matter what he says. I wouldn't have learned a darn thing. And if you had put me at the board and let me spend 10 minutes drawing circles and cubes and squares, I'd have enjoyed that, but I wouldn't have learned any math. The people who suffer here are the ones who can do math. And again, I'm going to ask you, don't listen to me. Listen to them. You know who the guy in that video is right there? That's Jason Zimba. Z-I-M-B-A. He is one of the 5 people who wrote Common Core. He is the man most responsible for Common Core math. He is called the architect of Common Core math. He's most responsible for it. And in this short video I'm going to play to you, he admits publicly that Common Core was never meant for college math, nor was it meant to prepare any of your kids for STEM careers. It will not prepare them. It will not make them ready to enter science, engineering, technology, or math careers. Get rid of those things. Science, engineering, technology, and math. And what are your kids going to do? They all can't become Shakespeare professors like me, all right? What are they going to do now? And the woman interviewing him, who draws this out of him, is Dr. Sandy Stotsky. You won't see her, but you'll hear her. This is going to blow you away. All right. The volume on this, give it a little bump, and it's a short clip. I may stop and start it a couple times so you know exactly what happens. Here's Jason Zimba.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
Yes, Dr. Sandy Stotsky, I think you're correct. My math program is a minimal definition of college readiness. Listen to that again.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
For some colleges.
Well, for the colleges most kids go to, but not that most parents probably aspire, right?
It's not for STEM. It's not for international
That's true. It's not only not for STEM, it's also not for selective colleges that, for example...
He's correcting her that it's worse than she thinks it is. My math curriculum is not only not for STEM, it's also not for selective colleges. And he's going to give you, when I play it again, the example of UC Berkeley. For instance, if your kid wants to go to UC Berkeley, he better have pre-calculus, even if he's not going to be an engineer. But that's deceptive, because all he means by selective college is any college that has a basic math requirement, and they all do. I'm not going to stop it this time. Listen through. It gets even worse at the end, all right? Now that you have some context, listen on from the beginning.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
For some colleges.
Well, for the colleges most kids go to, but not that most parents probably aspire, right?
It's not for STEM. It's not for international
That's true. It's not only not for STEM, it's also not for selective colleges that, for example, UC Berkeley, even whether you're going to be an engineer or not, you'd better have pre-calculus to get into UC Berkeley, right?
But we have to think of our engineering colleges
and that's
scientific
That's true.
education.
I think the third pathway goes a lot towards that, but your issue is really broader than that.
Oh, yes.
So I just wanted to make sure that we got that out.
I'm not just thinking of selective colleges. There's a much broader question here.
That's right. It's both, I think, in the sense of being clear about what this college readiness does and doesn't get you, and that's the big subject.
But not to call something college ready when it only applies to a certain kind of college and a certain lower level of mathematical expertise that won't buy you far on the international market in most major disciplines of technology, economics, business, and so on.
All he can do is shake his head yes. And if you think I'm doctoring this clip, you can go watch it on YouTube. He looks dumber when you watch the clip. It's not going to prepare your kids for science, engineering, business, math. These are the people who, and yet your school administrators and your politicians will look you in the eye tomorrow and tell you it's rigorous. The guy who wrote the standards just told you that they're not going to prepare your kids for STEM careers and they're not going to prepare them for college level math. Why are we debating this? There's nothing to debate. The people who did this told you exactly what they're doing. The dishonesty of this is galling, and what they're figuring on, what they're planning on, California, is that whenever somebody tries to tell you this, you get empty rooms like this one. That's what they're banking on. That there's too many t-ball games and basketball games and the NCAA tournament and too much to do here that you're not going to pay attention to this. And look around this room, because this happens everywhere I go. 70% of the people in my audiences are grandmas and grandpas. Where are all the kids who have kids? That's why they lie to you with impunity. That's why they jam this stuff down your throat. That's why they look you in the eye and tell you things that aren't true. When anybody can find these things on YouTube, the people who did it told you how they did it. That's the contempt they hold you in. And you remember when David Coleman said, you know, there's not a force on this planet that's going to stop me from making your teachers teach to my tests. And it's your educators in this state who are lying to you about that and think that this is okay. You know, right now you still own your kids. But I hope you're beginning to see that that's not going to go on much longer. This is serious. And then you got this. One more look, I told you, if you type into Google sexualized English lessons, Common Core English, you're going to get 1,000. If you type in stupid Common Core math into Google, you'll get 10,000 examples. Here's one for a 7-year-old, a second grader. The question says, tell how to make 10 when adding 8 plus 5. The little boy says, you cannot make 10 when adding 8 plus 5. That's a mathematical answer, isn't it? Teacher marks it wrong and writes, yes, you can. take 2 from 5 and add it to 8. 8 plus 2 equals 10, and then add 3. Now, if you think about that long enough, it kind of makes sense, but it's no longer math. This is word games now. This is Mad Libs. That's not mathematics. You're taking math, which is a serious, precise subject, and you're playing word games with it. You're playing artsy drawing games with it. And for kids who cannot grasp it the right way, maybe you let them do that after class. But this is how every kid has to do it now. Do you understand what that means to a 7-year-old? He's got it right. His instincts are good. You can't get 10 with 8 plus 5. What they just did to him was to replace math with weird, strange, analogic, utterly subjective, utterly non-mathematic ways of trying to reach an answer. That destroys kids. There's no way, particularly a kid who is gifted mathematically, there's no way they can do that. That's the inappropriateness of this. And I told you the science standards are coming. They're already feeding the next generation science standards into your kids' homework. Here they go. Watch this short clip. They're not just sexualizing math and English, they're sexualizing the new science standards. Take a listen to this little gem.
So do you understand why this is inappropriate, Audrey?
Audrey Basie just wanted to get her bio homework on DNA done when she got to a question that stumped her. It reads, the sister of the mom above also had issues with finding out who the father of her baby was. She had the state take a blood test of potential fathers. Based on the information in this table, why was the baby taken away by the state after the test? As if that question isn't tacky enough, look at the potential fathers: bartender, guy at the club, cab driver, or flight attendant. Father Larry Basie took one look at this piece of homework and flipped.
What are they teaching? What is this? I couldn't come up with the words. I'm like, oh my God. It's teaching them that it's okay to not know who it is because you can have the state help you. And if they can't help you, they're going to take your child away. And it's not the way it is.
Were you fired up?
Oh, I was beyond fired up last night.
That's shocking, but the big question that nobody asked, why in the world is that biology homework? It's a simple ratio problem, right? Remember when we were taking biology or chemistry or biology in high school? It was always pink rabbits, right? One bunny has brown eyes, the other bunny has blue eyes. If they mate, what is the percentage? This is different now. But did you notice what the final question asked? The purpose of doing the biology with math was not to get a science or math answer. It was a sociological answer. After you do your calculations, write a short essay on why the state took the baby away from the mother. Why are you doing that to kids in science? Why are you twisting math and science, like you're twisting English, into propaganda, into progressive ideology? Why are you doing that? You're not teaching them subjects, you're teaching them attitudes now. That is really staggering when you think about it. The thing that you have to do is use math to write social commentary. Use English class to engage in social political commentary. Your kids are being manipulated. And if you consider yourself a liberal progressive person, fine. You think this is okay because it benefits your worldview? Well, what happens the next time we elect some kooky right-wing president? And he then rewrites it to benefit him. You're going to be happy with that? Because if you don't stop it now, how dare you try to stop it when that happens? The politicizing of our classroom, the hijacking of our kids' education in the name of political ideology is a big deal because that's what every Marxist country ever did. That's what the Nazi fascists did. It's what the communists did. Get the kids, politicize their education, pull them away from their parents, sexualize them at young ages so you can re-indoctrinate them at the state level, convince them they belong to the government, not to you, not to the religious traditions. It doesn't even matter whether Common Core math and English aren't going to work. It's pretty clear they're not. They don't even care about that. They get what they want. This is what they want. You want more of this? Should we do more of this? How about this? This is a math assignment for an 8-year-old, another third grade one. And it's a doozy, right? It's a simple ratio problem. In the column on the left, you've got a series of numbers. Column A, you pay $289 for 2 tickets to a concert. Column B, I pay $266 for 3 tickets to a concert. Simple math problem. Do a ratio, right? That should end it. But that's not what the math problem's about. In the how do you do it section, activity. The title of this math activity is not ratios. It's called determining fairness. Here's the assignment. Work with a partner, always with a partner, never with a teacher. Work with a partner. Write a ratio for each sentence. Compare the ratios. If the ratio is equal, you must answer, it is fair. If the ratio is not equal, then you must answer, it is not fair. So the final answer is not a mathematical answer. What is it their business if I want to pay $1,000 for a concert ticket? Math is now being used to critique and undercut, among other things, free market capitalism. That's the whole lesson. In fact, look at the slide here. Math practice. The purpose of this math assignment is to justify your math conclusions. Not to do the math, not to demonstrate that you got the right answer. That's not the problem. The problem is after you do the math, tell us what we want to know socially about what's going on. Tell us what we want to hear about who should pay what for what. Is it fair? Is that what math is about? They don't care about your kids' math education. They want the end game here. I could go on for days with this, but I can't keep you that long. This should make you mad. This is from the website of the Irvine Unified School District. That's not very far from here. They took it down. I came here about 5-6 months ago and gave a bunch of talks, including one in Irvine. And when I gave that talk in Irvine 5 months ago, this was still on their website. Kind of funny, a couple weeks after we left Irvine, they took it down. But I got all the screenshots to show you about it. There are 40 different other school districts that I've found so far that have similar messages still up on their websites. What happened? In Irvine, California, moms and dads started to freak out because by the time kids were in 4th and 5th grade, they couldn't do simple addition in their head. They couldn't do basic multiplication. Yes, 8 times 8, they couldn't do it. They had to sit down with a pen and a paper by the time they were in 5th and draw all that stuff to be able to figure it out. So the moms and dads freaked, started hiring tutors, started having their kids work on math that was meant for upper grades, trying to get them ahead. The Irvine School District got really angry. They posted on their public website a threat and a warning to moms and dads. It's down now, but I've got the screenshots to show you it was there. Here's what the Irvine School District, here's how they warned your parents and threatened them. Quote, the links on this page are intended to support the classroom instruction that your child receives from his teacher. It is not appropriate to go ahead of the class or to use this site to have your child work on math intended for subsequent grades. That's the warning. Here's the threat. Your child's math instruction and math placement will not change as a result of working ahead. This means that your child will continue to work in the grade level appropriate math regardless of any work that is done and turned into the teacher. Your 5th grader might be ready for geography. He's staying with the 5th graders drawing circles. Your 7th grader may be ready for trigonometry. He stays with the 7th graders. That's why they're getting rid of calculus. That's why we're getting rid of gifted and talented programs. That's why we're doing away with honors colleges, because not everybody can be an honors kid. That's why California, you're leading the country in high schools that are getting rid of valedictorians, because it makes the non-valedictorians feel bad. That's what's happening. It's been going on long before Common Core. This is just the apotheosis of this. An American school district warning moms and dads, under no circumstances let your kids go ahead, and if you do, we will not let them in school. That meant that in 3rd grade, I was going to have to keep reading books like Beezus and Ramona for the next 7 years before I could get to books that actually challenged me. What do you think would have happened to my love of reading if that had happened? And what do you think is going to happen to the 7-year-old, the 8-year-old, the 10-year-old who can do math like that, but now is not allowed to because the other kids are going to feel bad if he does? And is that what you think this country is? And look, you don't even need to think about education to see how our country has succumbed to this. Unless everybody's the same, everything is wrong. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on here that has nothing to do with education. And I can only talk briefly because we're going to get Brad Dacus to come up here, and we got some of the ladies who have been working here who deal with things like what's going on data mining-wise. I'll give you an overview quickly of what goes on with the data mining. That's the new facility your federal government built in the Utah desert. That's the place they're going to house all the data they gather on your kids. That's where they're going to put it. Multi-billion-dollar facility. Interesting. They built it in the middle of the Utah desert. The people of Utah are so disgusted by this that they're trying to come up with legislation to cut water off to the building. And that's a big deal, because the most environmentally correct administration in American history built that in a desert where it requires 4 million gallons of water each day just to cool the computers that are going to record your kids' data. When you guys saw, when you did not take, California is an interesting case. You got all kinds of money, including money from Race to the Top, but you got it indirectly. Any state that took Common Core, even if they didn't win an immediate Race to the Top grant, they got all kinds of money coming to this. Wisconsin, my state, we didn't win a grant. We were the first state in the union to take Common Core. We didn't even win a grant. The minute we took it, we got $120 million from the feds, even though we didn't win a grant for taking it. And you got money for it too. Look at the contracts. You're a preschool kid. You did sign a preschool Race to the Top contract with the federal government. Look at that contract. By signing that contract, you, California, agree to share all kinds of data on your kids with the feds. You're doing it already. And then you got this. Here is the list just at the federal level alone. Look at the date on this. The date on this is December of 2014, 2.5 months ago. That is, as of the end of last year, every single federal agency that gets every bit of your kids' data information, testing information, and school records. 39 different federal agencies have access and receive every piece of data, psychological, mental health-wise, educational, all of it goes right to the, and look at some of the groups on here. This is just at the federal level. Did you know that the Department of Indian Affairs gets all your kids' information? The Office of Personnel Management, the National Science Foundation, Indian Health Services, Health and Human Service Assistant Secretary for Preparedness, right? The Administration for Children and Families, the Administration for Community Living, Food and Drug Administration, the Assistant Secretary for Legislation. Every one of those agencies get all the information collected on your kids. That's just at the federal level. And simply by taking Race to the Top money, you're participating in all of this. These tests that your kids have to take, these big national tests, they gather data on your kids. Every time your kids get a laptop or a tablet and you go, oh, awesome, my kid's got a free tablet, you do realize that what all kinds of programs and spyware that they've put on those computers. Encinitas is just the recent one, right? Where they found a way to freeze parents out completely. Do you see a theme here? Everything that goes on with Common Core, whatever else it does, it's designed to alienate kids from parents. It's designed to drive a wedge between families. This is what they're doing. We can talk more about that moving forward, certainly during the question and answer, because I know Brad's group is dealing with this big time. I want to end with this. This is Dr. Mary Callum. If I'm right about this, and Brad's right, and all these Christian servants are right, and everybody's right about this, Milgram, Stotsky, the Washington Democrats, the Chicago Teachers Union, if everybody's right about this, then this is going to cause significant psychological damage to your kids. If you're sexualizing kids at young ages, if you are making them think abstractly when they can't, there's going to be problems. This is Dr. Mary Calamia. She is a clinical psychiatrist and a child development specialist. She was a childhood practice in New York. Now, New York is one of 3 states that got Common Core way earlier than you did. Common Core was rolled out early in New York, Florida, and Kentucky, those 3 states. Those 3 states have already had 2 full years of proto-Common Core testing of the type your kids are getting now. And will it surprise you to learn that all 3 states want out? In New York, after the first year of testing, kids' reading and math scores fell from the 78th and 79th percentile all the way down to the mid-30s. That's why California, your state, has told you, we're not going to count the scores the first 2 years. You know why they're telling you that? because they don't want you to freak out when it happens. And so they're going to tell you, we won't count them. It doesn't change the fact that your kids are performing that badly. All right? This is a serious issue. So here's what happened. Mary was having her practice, and when Common Core kicked in, all these little kids with very serious behavioral problems started showing up. Here's her testimony before the New York Senate Select Committee on Common Core.
I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm a psychotherapist. I work with parents, children, and about half of my caseload is teachers also. My caseload represents about 20 different school districts in Suffolk County. In the fall of 2012, my phone started ringing. I started getting an inordinate number of referrals of students, a lot of honors students, 8th graders mostly, who were self-mutilating. They were cutting themselves with sharp objects, and they were burning themselves with cigarettes. My phone never stopped. And I didn't know why. I asked the kids, and all they kept saying was, "We can't take the pressure, it's too much." I also started getting a lot of elementary school students referred to me. They were refusing to go to school. They said they felt stupid and that school was too hard. They were throwing tantrums, begging to stay home, and upset to the point of vomiting. I was hearing from parents about kids bringing home homework they couldn't help them with. I was alarmed to hear that in some cases there were no textbooks for the parents to look at, and they had no idea what their children were learning. The teachers were reporting a staggering level of anxiety and depression, and that was when I first heard the term Common Core and learned about the standards that we now say set the bar so high anyone can walk right under it. Everyone was talking about the tests. As the school year progressed and the tests loomed, my patients were increasing their self-mutilating behaviors. They were complaining of insomnia, panic attacks, loss of appetite, depressed mood, and in one case, suicidal thoughts that resulted in a 2-week hospital stay for an adolescent. We can't regulate biology. Young children cannot engage in the type of critical thinking that the Common Core calls for. That would require a fully developed prefrontal cortex, a part of the brain that is not fully functional until adulthood. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for critical thinking, rational decision-making, and abstract thought, all things that the Common Core requires prematurely. We give children pre-assessments, tell them to succeed, and then give them tests on material they haven't learned and tell them it's okay to fail. They cannot resolve that mixed message. Last spring, a 6-year-old encountered a multiplication sign on the NWEA first grade math exam and asked the teacher what it was. The teacher was not allowed to help him and told him to just do his best. From that point on, the student's test performance went downhill. He couldn't shake off the unfamiliar symbol and couldn't believe his teacher wouldn't help him. The Common Core requires children to read informational texts that are owned by a handful of corporations. They don't have a filter to distinguish good information from bad. So whatever you put in front of them, they take that as gospel. They're literal. So when we give them a textbook that explains the Second Amendment as the people have the right to keep and bear arms in a state militia, they will look no further for clarification. We ask them to write critically using emotionally charged language to persuade instead of inform. They don't have that functional prefrontal cortex, so they tap into their limbic system, which is the part of the brain that involves basic human emotions, anger and fear being the foremost. So when we ask them to use emotionally charged language, we're actually asking them to fuel their language with fear and anger and aggression. They cannot temper this judgment. They don't have the ability to do that. So we teach to the test, which I think doesn't really measure learning. I think the tests measure endurance and resilience. Only a child who can sit still for 90 minutes, come back the next day and do it again, and the next day again, can succeed. I'm going to introduce you to a couple, I'm almost done. I'm going to introduce you just a couple of student stories, okay? A couple of the faces of the Common Core. We have an entire 3rd grade class that spent the entire day sobbing after one testing session. A 2nd grader who witnessed this is now in 3rd grade and won't go to school. She's being evaluated, a 7-year-old being evaluated for psychotropic medication just to get her to go to school. A 6-year-old who came home crying because in September, in the 1st grade, she didn't know what a vertex was. 2 8-year-olds opted out of the ELA exam and were publicly denied cookies because the teacher gave them to the class but wouldn't give them to them. And that teacher, who under duress felt obligated to do such a thing. A 6th grader who once aspired to be a writer but now won't do it because we do it all day long, even in math. And a mother who has to leave work early because her son is hysterical over his math homework, and his CPA grandfather who's babysitting for him can't even help him do it. And countless other kids who are refusing to go to school, feel stupid, and now are completely turned off to education. I will conclude with this one thought. Our country became a superpower on the backs of men and women who learned in one-room schoolhouses. This isn't rocket science. It doesn't take a great deal of technology or corporate or government involvement to help our children to succeed. We need to rethink the Common Core and the associated high-stakes testing and get back to the business of educating our children in a safe, healthy, and productive manner. Thank you.
I saved this for last. I've talked to over a dozen lawyers about this, and Attorney Dacus sort of confirmed it yesterday as well, and he may say a word about this at the end. If Common Core is what you're told it is, if it's just a benign set of innocent, non-political standards that our kids should be aiming for, why in the world did the Common Core indemnify itself this way? This is the second half of that copyright that I didn't show you at the outset. If this is all it is, innocent standards, then why did they write this? And the dozen lawyers I've talked to all said the same thing. This is not standard indemnification. This is not what, if all they're trying to do is help your kids learn, you don't write this. Here's the section, you ready? Under no circumstance shall the NGA Center or the CCSSO individually or jointly be liable for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, exemplary, consequential, or punitive damages, however caused, and on any legal theory of liability, whether for contract, tort, strict liability, or a combination thereof, arising in any way out of the use of the Common Core state standards, even if you advise us of the possibility of such risk beforehand. What a wonderful gig. Even if you point out to us that our standards are hurting and destroying kids, even if you point that out to us, you still can't sue us. If we know in advance that what we're doing is going to harm your kids, you still can't sue us. Attorney Dacus will tell you what he said last night. This won't hold up in court. You're dumb. That would be like me taking out a car insurance, getting my driver's license, and making the highwaymen, the cops, offering a waiver that no matter what I do on the road, for any reason, you can't hold me accountable. Even if you tell me driving drunk is bad, you can't hold me accountable for that. I don't think that's going to stand up either. But my final point to you is this point. If this is what they say it is, why in the world are they doing this? They're telling you that no matter what this does to your kids, you have no liability. They have no liability. You can't sue them. Even if they know beforehand, you don't do that if Common Core is what they tell you it is. Everything you've seen today has not come from me. None of it. I'll give you all of it. But I'm going to say this. At the end of this talk today, now you're going to get my opinion. Because I've not heard anybody phrase it this way, so this is 100% me. Blame me for this. For the last 40 or 50 years, our kids have gotten their ABCs and their 1, 2, 3s. But while they've gotten them, they've been slowly and surely politicized. I think it's undeniable. I see it in college every time. Our kids have learned, but as they've been learned, they've been pushed politically. They've been becoming more politicized as education goes on. Well, now I think what Common Core represents is the first time in our history the actual ABCs and 1, 2, 3s are now less important than the sociology. We flipped that. The purpose of education, it used to be we want to educate kids and then give them a good heavy dose of what we think is politically right. Now, the politics comes first. They don't even care about the education. As a matter of fact, as you heard Bill Gates say and David Coleman say and Jason Zimba say, we're not even terribly interested in educating your kids. We want to turn them in to the kids we think they should be. Not you think they should be, not your religious traditions think they should be, but we think they should be. That's a big deal. I'm going to bring Brad up right away. I want to give him a moment to tell you what he does, and then we'll jointly answer some questions. But on a Friday night, I am very grateful that you listened to me. That's all I asked of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was really good.